Hey, so today we're really excited to have Zach Parolin here. He is going to talk about the intergenerational persistence of poverty in high-income countries. He's an assistant professor of social policy at Bocconi University. His work looks at the measurements and determinants of poverty and social inequality in high-income countries. For example, he's worked to produce timely measures of poverty in the COVID-19 pandemic and a new decomposition framework for understanding the drivers of poverty and inequality, and to understand how recent policy changes in the US have impacted child poverty and food hardship. His work has been recently supported by the European Research Council with a starting grant project on the experience of poverty in the post-industrial economy. The aim is to make major advancements in the understanding of the measurement, sources, and consequences of poverty and social inequality in high-income countries. His work is featured consistently in the New York Times, the Economist, and the Washington Post, which is the one I read, to name a few, covering his research on poverty rates in the US and the social policies that mitigate poverty. Sorry, I just realized I've never had to say your university out loud, so I have no idea how to pronounce it. So please correct me if I completely butchered it. I've never had to read that out loud. So without further delay, I'll hand the floor over to Zach so he can start his talk.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks to you all for being here and in general for the invitation. It's nice to meet a new group here, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback on the talk today. The presentation itself is going to focus on the intergenerational persistence of poverty in high-income countries. And this is collaborative work with my colleagues at Bocconi here, Jos Desvin Anderson and Raphael Pinto-Schmidt. And I want to emphasize from the start that this is very preliminary work. There's not even a paper yet. And I say that as a way to give you all permission to share your criticisms or feedback or questions or general thoughts at the end of this, because we're really hoping to get some useful feedback to further develop the paper as we go on here. So with that said, I will start with what I think is a pretty uncontroversial statement, and that statement is this: that children growing up in poverty are more likely than children who do not grow up in poverty to also experience poverty in adulthood. We have plenty of evidence on that from prior literature. So you can visualize this relationship there at the bottom. There's some connection between your exposure to poverty in childhood and your exposure to poverty in adulthood. But we know that that relationship can vary a lot across place. Point estimates from prior studies suggest that the consequences of having low family income during childhood are more severe in some countries compared to others. And in the United States in particular, we have evidence from the intergenerational mobility literature that there might be a stronger persistence of poverty or disadvantage across generations. Though, as I'll talk about, most of that evidence is based on individual earnings or pre-tax, pre-transfer income. So again, at the bottom, we can visualize this and say, maybe in country X, the relationship is that strong, but perhaps in the United States, it's even stronger. I want to pause for a minute and make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of vocabulary and what we're going to look at in this presentation. So there's a much broader literature on intergenerational mobility, primarily focused on income, though in the sociology literature also education, occupation, and more. And in general, to provide a broad description of this literature, it often focuses on downward and upward mobility together. It's often focused on earnings, individual earnings, even in some of the, let's say, more prominent work in this field from Miles Korak or Greg and others that focus on poverty. They're often focused on adult earnings as opposed to, say, post-tax transfer income, and we'll talk about the implications of that. In the intergenerational poverty world, which is where this paper is situated, we're really only focused on upward mobility, not downward mobility, but upward mobility from a state of disadvantage or deprivation. We're going to focus on household income as we traditionally do in the poverty literature, including all taxes and transfers. And again, I'll document the importance of looking at taxes and transfers throughout this presentation, and really focusing on poverty as this conceptual idea, this conceptual focus on how individuals and households consume and whether they have adequate consumption power to maintain a decent livelihood. So a slight difference when we focus on intergenerational poverty versus intergenerational income mobility more broadly. And specifically, the questions that we are asking in this paper are as follows. How does the US compare to other high-income countries with respect to the intergenerational persistence of poverty? And what explains differential rates of intergenerational persistence of poverty in the United States, the country that's primary focus in this paper, versus other high-income countries? And these other high-income countries, as I'll elaborate on, include the UK. So I'm particularly looking forward to hearing your feedback on some of the UK results and the data decisions we've had to make. We'll talk about that. Also, Switzerland, Germany, and Australia. We're in the process of adding Denmark, but we're not going to have any Danish data in the presentation today. And when we think about this second question, so what might explain the differential rates of intergenerational poverty persistence across place? There are a number of different perspectives we could think about and walk through, and that I'm going to walk through in a moment. These 7 perspectives in particular are the focus of this paper, trying to adjudicate these competing perspectives to explain the differences we see across countries, particularly in the US versus our other high-income countries, is the primary goal of this work. And the 7 perspectives in brief, and then I'll elaborate on them. One is focused on family resources and child investment. Another goes beyond income and says, what about family characteristics like family structure when you grow up, or parental education and so forth beyond just income? In the US in particular, there's been a large literature on place. We'll talk about that. Then there's this number of mediation effects that might shape that relationship between childhood disadvantage and adulthood. So we'll talk about what I call benchmark access effects, market rewards packages, and the role of taxes and transfers in shaping the strength of these mediation effects. And finally, we'll talk about what's more or less a residual term, the unexplained poverty persistence effects. So I'm going to go through these and elaborate on them in a little more detail, about 1 minute each, but starting with the most basic perspective that family income probably matters for child development. We know it can matter through channels such as greater investments, greater consumption power, to improve opportunities for child enrichment and to improve later life outcomes. We have plenty of evidence on that. It can reduce family stress, which might itself, independent of the investment channel, affect child well-being and development. And we have some pretty strong causal evidence on the positive role in taxes and transfers for later life employment and education outcomes. But there is a literature that questions whether it's really the income that matters, or if it's more about other family characteristics that are associated with lower income. So Susan Meyer in particular has argued in the past that perhaps it's family characteristics, not income. Of course, they're correlated, but perhaps it's really about the characteristics that matter for a child's future outcomes. We can think of this in terms of parental employment, having the 2 parents in the home as opposed to 1, parental education, and so on. And you can see that visualized down here at the bottom of the screen. There's another line in the literature that says, well, okay, income matters, family structure might matter, but also place might matter. It might be where you grow up, with the neighborhood that you are raised in, that matters more for later life opportunity. In the US especially, there's been a strong focus on place effects as a pathway linking childhood and adult opportunity. Think of the work of Pat Sharkey, Rod Shetty team, Sandy Jinks, Bill Wilson. And there's evidence that being in these disadvantaged neighborhoods can have direct and also contextual effects on well-being and opportunity. So one unique part about the US data we're going to use in this study is that we can measure the neighborhood where an individual grew up. We have access to the geocoded data, and we can try to get a sense of whether variation across place really matters for why the US might have higher intergenerational persistence of poverty compared to other countries. Finally, we can move into our mediation effects. So if you see on the right side of the screen, beta 1 there in the red box, this is representing the link between poverty during childhood and some benchmarks in adulthood that are traditionally associated with reduced poverty. That's why you see this is labeled the benchmark attainment channel. These benchmarks can include education. Education has been perhaps the dominant focus in this literature, but also employment, health, family structure, and other characteristics that form after childhood and shaping disadvantage in adulthood. So the benchmark attainment effect might suggest that maybe some countries have higher poverty persistence than others because of that link between childhood poverty and, say, your likelihood of getting a university degree. Maybe that's stronger in some places than in others, and that might help to explain why, for example, the United States has a stronger persistence of poverty than other countries. That's a hypothesis. But there's also the other side of this equation when we talk about mediation effects. If you look at beta 2 in the red box, it's to what extent do those benchmarks matter for poverty in adulthood? And that, of course, can vary across place as well. So differential sorting into these benchmarks only matters if those benchmarks do indeed lead to better adult outcomes. And this channel highlighted here, we're labeling the market's reward packages, because first we're going to focus on the pre-tax and pre-transfer income gains associated with meeting one of these benchmarks. So primarily earnings associated with education, employment, and family structure in adulthood. And sorting into education and these other benchmarks, plus greater market rewards associated with, say, higher education, it could fully explain some of that childhood poverty to adult poverty relationship. That's something we'll test. But importantly, the market and pre-tax, pre-transfer rewards packages is only one part of the story here with respect to the beta 2. Tax and transfers might matter as well in providing an insurance effect to offset some of the, let's say, disadvantage associated with not having that university degree or being in a single parent as opposed to two-parent family, and so on. We have plenty of evidence of this from the cross-sectional literature on poverty. We know that taxes and transfers strongly reduce point-in-time poverty rates. They can provide an insurance effect for adults who fail to meet a benchmark, perhaps because they were more exposed to poverty in childhood. Relative to the pre-tax and transfer rewards packages, when we account for taxes and transfers, it might reduce the relative gain associated with meeting a certain benchmark. So maybe, for example, if we focus on market earnings, having a university degree means a lot. But when we include taxes and transfers, which offset some of that disadvantage at the bottom, that premium might shrink a little bit. That's what we're testing here. And finally, there's a beta 3 in the red box here is basically a residual term. We label it the unexplained persistent poverty effects. Even after accounting for family education, neighborhood effects, these mediating effects in the middle, there might be a remaining unexplained relationship between child poverty and adult poverty. It's unexplained. In some parts of the literature, it's called the direct effect of social origins on adult outcomes. It generally must be channeled through alternative unobserved pathways, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have omitted variable bias here. This can also reflect variation in, or it can also reflect real differences across country and perhaps the cruelness or consequence of poverty. And I'll show you at the end how this unexplained term varies across country and how we might be able to interpret it. So just to recap the different perspectives that we're going to get into here in a moment, it's these 7, and again, the goal of this paper is really to adjudicate among these competing perspectives to help explain this cross-national variation in the intergenerational persistence of poverty that we see. That's the framing, that's the goal of the paper. How are we actually going to execute that? We're going to use harmonized cross-national panel data files. So panel data, we can follow the same people over time in the data using the work of the cross-national equivalent files, or CNF, from Ohio State University in the United States. They've helped to harmonize the data sets you see on the screen so that we can somewhat reasonably compare life trajectories for, say, people growing up in the US versus the UK versus Australia, Germany, and Switzerland. One note I'll emphasize here, especially for the UK audience, we are using both the British Household Panel Survey and the Household Longitudinal Study among the respondents that are observed in both. You all probably know better than I do. There's some real challenges in doing this, some changes in the income variables between the two surveys. Harmonizing the education variables for the UK versus the others is more challenging than it seems like it should be. So we can talk about this later, but I am looking forward to your thoughts on whether you think our use of the UK data here is justified or totally crazy. So with all of these data sets, we're going to impose some sample restrictions to make sure we're looking at somewhat comparable lives in each of these data sets. The primary restrictions are that each respondent we look at must be observed at least 5 years during childhood. So under age 18, we want a decent amount of childhood to estimate their exposure to childhood poverty. And each respondent needs to be observed at least once between age 25 and 35. And if they are observed at age 35, we're going to primarily use that data. But even if they're observed at age 27, for example, we're going to use data from 25 to 27 to capture their adult economic outcomes. For the US data, we can go a little bit further. We have some restricted access data with the geographic identifiers and also data on race ethnicity of the respondent to try to see if that changes the US story at all compared to these other countries. Measuring poverty, if you follow this literature, nothing here will come as a surprise. So we're using all taxes and transfers, income calculated at the household level. Poverty thresholds here are set at 50% of the national annual median income adjusted for family size. When we measure exposure to childhood poverty, we're looking at the mean poverty rate from age 0 to 17. So capturing average exposure to poverty during childhood. And in early adulthood, we're capturing poverty between age 25 and 35, the average. So again, if they're observed all 10 years during that span, we take the mean poverty rate among that span. Family background, we're going to measure the share of childhood in home with no mother present or no father present, share of childhood in a single parent home, age of mother at birth, maternal employment, education of the mother, the average number of children in the home during childhood. And again, in the US, we're going to add this place information, specifically the county in which the adult spent his or her childhood. These mediators of interest, we're primarily looking at education, employment, family structure, and kind of a weak indicator of health. It's a self-reported health scale on a 1 to 5 scale. Education, the equivalent of a high school degree or more is the best we can do in the harmonized framework. We can talk about that. And for employment, we're looking at whether you are employed, but also if you are working more than 30 hours a week as opposed to fewer hours. The models are incredibly simple. We are not trying to produce causal estimates of the effect of childhood poverty on adult poverty. We're using associational evidence to look at variation across place and to try to unpack why that variation exists. So we're using OLS estimates that regress poverty in young adulthood on exposure to childhood poverty. We'll control for a couple basic things, gender and age, because we have a little age variation in that adulthood setting. We'll capture year effects, and that what's highlighted in the red box there is our primary measure of the intergenerational persistence of poverty. How is your exposure to childhood poverty associated with your likelihood of poverty in adulthood? We'll extend this in a number of ways. We'll add in those family background controls, the place and race effects in the US, and so on. And we can bring in our mediation effects as well, again, to see when we add our mediators, education, employment, and family structure, to what extent does that help us explain that relationship of childhood poverty to young adult poverty. So let's get into the findings and start with this basic question of what variation across high-income countries do we see in the intergenerational persistence of poverty? Just going to highlight a few descriptive findings here. So here's just the poverty rate in young adulthood for each country across our samples. You see, the US has an average young adult poverty rate of about 17.9%. So that's compared to 11.3% for the UK, 9% for Australia, and so on. From this box, we can basically conclude that the US has a higher young adult poverty rate relative to other countries, at least among the years and the samples that we're looking at. How is that connected to childhood poverty? Well, we can look at mean exposure to childhood poverty among these countries. And we see that the U.S., the average adult in the U.S. also spent more of his childhood in poverty, about 18.6% of childhood in poverty, compared to as low as 5% for Germany. This is capturing the average relationship between those two variables, and this is our primary coefficient of interest throughout the rest of the study. Here is the association of childhood poverty with adult poverty. And you can see in the US, this coefficient is 0.43. So if you spent your entire childhood in poverty, you are 43 percentage points more likely to also be poor in adulthood in the US. The UK, that coefficient is 16 points, Australia 21, Germany 29, Switzerland 28. I'm curious your thoughts later, whether you are skeptical as to the UK number here performing better than the other countries. If we want, we can also look at the adult poverty rate with no exposure to childhood poverty, and the point here is there's not much difference. So a lot of these adult poverty rates are actually due to differences in exposure to childhood poverty and the strength of the relationship between childhood poverty and young adult poverty. But again, I want to emphasize that what's in the red box here is what we're going to focus on for the rest of the presentation, that relationship of childhood poverty with adult poverty. We're going to walk through our 7 perspectives and try to get a sense of which ones matter most and explaining this variation that we're looking at there. So just to recap, the first 3 we're going to look at: family resources, family background, and place for the US as well. So here in the red box, we're again looking at now the intergenerational persistence of poverty, conditional on age and gender. So it's almost identical to what we saw in the table before, just adding a couple of basic controls. And the story doesn't change as expected. So the US here has higher intergenerational persistence of poverty relative to our other countries. The UK, again, it has the lowest in this table here. When we add in our family background controls, so again, parental education, single parent versus 2-parent when you were young, other information like this, we do, as expected, see in general decline in these coefficients. So the US still has higher poverty persistence compared to other countries, 0.34 now. The next highest is 27 points in the UK. The coefficients dropped slightly for all except Switzerland, but are generally positive and significant. So income still appears to matter or be associated with adult poverty, independent of family background characteristics that are associated with lower income, like single parenthood or maternal education and employment, and so on. Does place matter much, or race, ethnicity, variation in that, at least in explaining cross-national differences? The answer is not really. So when we add in place and race, ethnicity effects in the US, basically control for those, we still see that the US has higher poverty persistence than any other country we're looking at. So despite the pretty dominant focus of place in the US, which does matter in explaining within country variation, we don't see the controlling for that makes the US much different in terms of its poverty persistence relative to other countries, as we would get if we excluded place. So what about these mediation effects? Do we see meaningful variation there that might help us explain this story? Let's start by looking at the benchmark access effects, which again is capturing variation in that relationship of childhood poverty with your likelihood of, say, getting a college degree or being employed or being in a certain family structure in adulthood. So we're going to look at a few figures like this. So we'll pause and make sure we all understand what's going on. The x-axis, you just see each country labeled there: Australia, Germany, Switzerland, UK, US. The y-axis is the association of childhood poverty with the outcome that's labeled. There's 2 bars. You can basically, maybe simplest, just focused on the black circles for each. This is showing that in general, spending more of your childhood in poverty is associated with reduced likelihood of completing a high school degree or equivalent, so A levels, I believe. You see it's negative for all countries with the black dots. Controlling for family background messes things up a little bit for the UK, but in general, we see the results we would expect. And for most of these countries, again, the UK, kind of a weird exception here, we don't see much variation in the size of that penalty. So it hovers around 20 to 25 percentage point disadvantage in Australia, Germany, Switzerland, and the US. The benchmark access, it matters, but we're not seeing much variation across the country. What about more than high school, which is most often a university degree in the data, but can also include some intermediate steps? We see that, again, for the most part, more poverty, reduced likelihood of moving beyond high school, not surprising, but we don't actually see that much variation across countries. The US is the lowest tier before accounting for family background, but when we do, it's not that much different from Switzerland and Australia, but maybe a little bit larger penalty here in the US compared to the other countries. What about the reduced likelihood of being employed in adulthood? We do see, again, generally negative effects. Germany is a slight exception. Not tons of country variation looking at the US versus the UK and Switzerland, for example. And we could do this for single parenthood, good health, and so on, but the general story is the same, that we see a little bit of variation in some of these indicators with respect to how childhood poverty shapes the likelihood of meeting these benchmarks. Not a ton, and I'll show you in a few slides statistically how much of the variation it explains, but the short answer is not a lot. So what about the returns to those benchmarks? Again, we could look at the pre-tax transfer returns or those market rewards packages, or we could then look at what happens when we include taxes and transfers into the story. So again, we're going to walk through these different benchmarks. The meaning of the blue and black dots has changed a little bit. So look at the bottom of the screen. You see that the black dots now represent the pre-tax, pre-transfer poverty rate associated with meeting a given benchmark or not. And the blue triangle represents that relationship after accounting for taxes and transfers. So the y-axis here in this figure is now, if you did not complete a high school degree or equivalent, what's the extra likelihood that you are in poverty as an adult? If we look in general, we see that not achieving a high school degree or equivalent is universally associated with an increased likelihood of poverty. That's not a surprise. But we do see a couple interesting findings. First, the penalty in the US is consistently larger, about a 35-point penalty for not having the equivalent of a high school degree. And look what happens in the US versus other countries when we advance from pre-tax transfer penalty to post-tax transfer penalty. In the US, there's virtually no difference between the blue and the black dots. Look in Australia on the far side, as a counterexample, accounting for taxes and transfers really reduces the penalty associated with not having a high school degree. It's providing some kind of insurance effect to offset the disadvantage associated with not meeting that benchmark. We see really a similar story when we look at joblessness. So much higher likelihood of poverty in the US when we focus on the blue triangles, so when taxes and transfers are included. But if we focus on pre-tax transfer, we see that the US isn't that much different than, let's say, the UK or Australia, large penalties for not being employed. The market rewards of employment before, I said this tax and transfers is comparable in the US, UK, and Australia, but taxes and transfers are doing a lot more to reduce the penalty associated with poverty in Australia and Germany, and in the UK in particular, reducing that association of not being employed with poverty and adulthood. Again, somewhat similar for single parenthood, taxes and transfers doing more in some places, less in others. So the last set of results I'll show you before we start to summarize the findings is this final part, the unexplained poverty persistent effects. So even after we account for family background, place, the mediating effects, taxes and transfer, insurance effects, how much of the association of poverty in childhood versus adulthood is left unexplained? That's what we're visualizing here in this red box for the US. We'll get to other countries in a moment. The y-axis here is, again, that association of childhood poverty with adult poverty, exactly as defined in beta 3 here. Here, we're going to start by looking at pre-tax, pre-transfer poverty. You look at the labels on the top, and then we'll look at post-tax, post-transfer in a minute and see how that matters in shaping this story. So if we look at the US and make sure we all understand these results, if we're just controlling for age, gender, and family background, that's the black dot here, we see that there's about a 35 percentage point disadvantage that's unexplained, that still persists despite accounting for these controls. Specifically, there's a strong relationship between childhood poverty and young adult poverty that's not yet explained. When we add in our mediating factors, that's the blue, it drops a little bit. When we add in race and place for the US, which we can't do for the other countries, it drops a little bit, but still about 20 percentage point penalty. Unexplained association of childhood poverty with young adult poverty. Let's expand a look at the UK. This is still pre-tax, pre-transfer. You can see that, again, especially focused on the blue lines, when we account for these mediating effects, even in the UK, there's about a 15 percentage point disadvantage that's not explained by anything we've accounted for so far in the pre-tax transfer poverty space here in adulthood. Not that much different from the US really so far. Again, pre-tax transfer, we can look at our other countries. We see for Australia and Germany, a somewhat similar story. The main outlier here is Switzerland, where when we account for these, again, market rewards packages attached to the mediators, it basically fully explains the intergenerational poverty relationship in Switzerland. The residual goes down to essentially zero. But I want to focus now on what happens when we bring taxes and transfers into the story. So it's the same visualization, but now we're just switching the outcome variable to post-tax transfer poverty and adulthood. And you see the US looks very similar as it did before. That there's still, no matter which of these lines you're looking at, it's pretty strong and persistent poverty effect, even after accounting for everything we've thrown into our models in the US. The UK, on the other hand, the tax and transfer insurance effect, combined with the mediators that are in the blue line here, basically fully explain that intergenerational poverty story. The residual is close to zero. This is insignificant, suggesting that in the UK, there's a strong tax and transfer effect that's reducing the intergenerational persistence of poverty, primarily by providing insurance through transfers for people in disadvantaged positions in adulthood. And those disadvantaged positions, of course, being associated with disadvantage in childhood. But in this sense, the penalty of being in those disadvantaged positions, not having the equivalent of a university degree, for example, is slightly offset through taxes and transfers, is essentially what this is showing. Again, Australia, it's the same story, that the blue line falls to zero. Switzerland was already there. Germany, interestingly, still has about a 20-point residual effect, which we can talk about at the end. This is just one final graph that summarizes the differences across the countries in each of the different perspectives on intergenerational poverty that we've looked at before. It's a little bit ugly because I made it just this morning, but wanted some kind of summary figure that places this really in a decomposition framework that allows us to understand the differences. So on the far left, you see IG-POV, that's intergenerational poverty. That's just summarizing the general relationship between childhood poverty and young adult poverty. And the blue line in the far left is what we've seen. It's stronger for the US. And we can go to each of these different indicators and try to understand the main differences. So in Australia, family background matters a little bit more in explaining your adult outcomes than in, say, the US or Switzerland and Germany. The mediating effects we looked at mattered more in the UK than they did elsewhere. But at the same time, transfers did more in the UK than in the other countries we're looking at to, again, reduce intergenerational poverty by reducing that disadvantage in adulthood. And the residual term, as we looked at before, it's strongest for the US, but still a little bit for Germany and less so for the other countries. So to summarize what we see in the US, there's weak tax and transfer insurance effects. We saw before a pretty weak place and race effects, and the intergenerational poverty persistence is largely unexplained. It's in this residual term. For the UK and Australia, larger effects of family background, but also large insurance effects through transfers. Germany, less family background, more unexplained. That's the yellow bar on the here. And in Switzerland, market rewards packages associated with benchmarks explain most of that relationship. So let's return to the questions I put forth at the start of the presentation, and then I welcome questions and feedback. How does the US compare to other high-income countries with respect to intergenerational poverty, and why? We see much stronger intergenerational persistence of poverty in the US, so twice as strong as in Australia, 3 times stronger than in the UK. And that strong persistence of poverty in the US is not primarily channeled through family background effects, like being raised by, say, single parents. It's not primarily channeled through place effects, like the state and county where adults grew up. It's not primarily channeled through differential attainment of education or differential market rewards packages associated with the benchmarks. Instead, the primary difference compared to some of these other countries, the UK and Australia in particular, is the weaker tax and transfer insurance effects in the US and reducing adult poverty among those with lower employment and education. There's a stronger unexplained poverty persistence in the US compared to most of the countries, with the slight exception of Germany. There's a lot of work to do before I can give you these implications with a serious face, but the early implications, if these results were to hold, might be that intergenerational poverty is not necessarily equivalent to the intergenerational mobility story. And arguably, from a welfare perspective, maybe it makes more sense to focus on upward mobility than, say, intergenerational income elasticities in general, but that could be debated. What I do think is clear is that income definition matters a lot, both conceptually and empirically. So taxes and transfers affect household well-being and consumption power. Including them into the intergenerational disadvantage story really changes the story a lot, as we saw in the UK example. And prior studies focused on intergenerational poverty have often actually focused on pre-tax, pre-transfer income. And we see some of the implications and what we're missing when we do that from the results I just showed you. In all countries, income and poverty status matter beyond observed family characteristics. And perhaps we can conclude that the strong US focus on neighborhood effects seems to matter little in explaining the US performance versus other high-income countries. There's a lot of work to do. What's that unexplained residual term really about? Can we directly compare these results to the intergenerational mobility literature? Still a few harmonization challenges to resolve, especially around the UK. And I'm sure there's other things that are missing or unclear or unconvincing. So that being said, I'll stop here and really do welcome your thoughts and feedback on how we can take this paper forward. So thanks a lot.